William Boyd graduated from Edinburgh in 1954. He became a fellow at this college in 1971. He trained as a psychiatrist, and his last appointment before retiring was a medical commissioner in the Mental Welfare Commission. Dr. Boyd, you were born in November of 1930.
That's right.
Could you tell me something about your family to begin with?
Yes, and about my birth on the 9th of November, because I was an only child. My father was the physician superintendent, or medical superintendent as it was called then, of, again, the Fife District Asylum, as it was called, the psychiatric hospital dealing with Fife and Kinross. So, just finishing the family bit, I was an only child. My mother and father both came from Edinburgh and never quite forgot their Edinburgh roots. But I was a Fifer, and when pushed, I still say I'm a Fifer.
The date of 1930 just made me think a little bit about what social conditions were like. I mean, that was really in the Great Depression, wasn't it? I mean, did this affect Cooper? Is it the industrial parts of Scotland? Or were you aware?
Cooper was an agricultural little county town with market and whatnot. There was the sugar beet factory. But you know, the mental hospital in those days, and right through till the 50s, I would think, was a little institution all of its own, a little empire. And in the 30s, and right through the war, the physician superintendent was the lord of his domain. And so I was sent away to school, so I wasn't at home all the time. But I lived in fairly cosseted surroundings, I must say.
So you've already answered two of the things that people would be curious about. I mean, you already had a family medical background.
Yes.
Which no doubt influenced you
in
some way. Do you think right from the beginning?
I'm sure it did. Yeah. I'm sure it did. I was totally involved in the hospital. As a little boy, I would go around the place with my father. I've said before now how much I remember of that. I remember the smell of paraldehyde in the corridors as you walked around. And the friendliness of the place, really. I used to go to the patients' dances. I learnt to dance in the hospital, if that's any claim to fame. I just felt thoroughly at home there.
My memory as it is, of institutions of that kind in these years was that there was a fairly static patient population. Was that the case? You had presumably lots of things like tertiary syphilis and so on.
Oh, in terms of diagnosis, yes. And yes, that's right, GPI, and also the post-influenzal Parkinsonism. That was another. There were a number of cases. I can't really think back now to... I wasn't a good diagnostician at age 9, really, but...
I was just thinking that possibly the patients that you were seeing then, that population had changed by the end of your career.
Oh, I'm sure so. Yes. I mean, I remember there were individuals in the hospital who were characters and who were well known to not the public, but to everyone in the hospital, favourites really. And I used to know them very well indeed.
So the fact that it was a community on its own, and you weren't, in that sense, really part of Cooper, were you?
Not really.
That possibly influenced the choice of school then, you going away to...
Oh, I know. I have to explain that to people nowadays. But at the time, I was an only child. I've said that twice now. I was an only child. I had 2 or 3 friends in Cooper, and I think my parents, who might easily have spoilt me totally, my mother especially, controlled me, no doubt. They both agreed that they obviously did agree that I should go off to school. And I went off when I was nearly 7 to boarding school. I don't think it was a bad idea. No. At all. I seemed to get on all right.
Could you tell me a bit about the school? Because I think there's always in some interest just to what influence a particular school or people that the school have on developing the idea towards medicine? Was Glenalmond orientated in that way towards the profession?
Yes, but you see, when I went to school at 7, this was a little boarding school in Fife with about 30 pupils, and during the war it dropped to about 25 pupils. And it was very strict. The headmaster was not a chap I look back on with great enjoyment, pleasure. It was strict discipline. And then things were tight during the war, so that the things we remember are blackout. But I mean, nothing like people suffered in cities and in other parts of Britain. But we're caught up in the war. We used to be allowed up, the big occasion, we were allowed up in our dressing gowns to go and listen to Winston Churchill doing one of his speeches. I still remember them very well. I don't remember the exact nature of them, but I remember the feeling of enthusiasm and patriotism, not waving flags, but thinking we were waving flags.
And then you went to...
And then I went to Glenalmond.
Then what age you be there?
That would be 13, I suppose, for 4 years.
And what was the sort of orientation in that school in relation, as I said, to professions, to sciences? And
well, I had gone to Glenalmond on a minor scholarship, and it was a classical scholarship, because at this prep school I was at, we learnt Greek and Latin and so on. I don't know if there's a so on. Greek and Latin. And so I found myself in the classical stream, and neither my parents nor I had got around to putting up an arm and saying, "Excuse me, sir, but I want to be a doctor," because it was sort of assumed that I was going to be a doctor. And so I had to make a rapid change halfway through my school career and do science. And maybe that's why to this day I've never been very confident about chemistry and biochemistry and so on. I did not enjoy that course at all.
Were there any inspirational figures at the school of influence on you, do you think? Particularly?
No, I wouldn't. I think the ethos of the school probably has left its mark on me in the way of discipline, keeping to rules, not walking on the grass with your hands in your pockets, crazy things like that, which have some kind of long-term effect of, knowing where you stand with other people.
And I suppose that then it was quite early, it was determined that you would go to Edinburgh as well. Since
yes, that was my first choice.
Was your acceptance as a student, was that quite easy and straightforward at that time?
It was quite straight. I mean, I got into Edinburgh. It was a time when some people would be going straight off to the services, of course. I forget the detail of that, but at that time it seemed to be straightforward.
There wasn't, I think still at that time, and certainly the medical school I went to, it was a considerable help in entry. If your father was a doctor, that was taken into consideration. Do you think that was it looked at?
I don't know. Possibly. The fact that he'd been at Edinburgh too, of course.
Yes.
I dare say. I really don't remember any particular. It was just one of these things that you did somehow.
I just mention it because it's a concept that would be pretty foreign to people now.
Well, I was thinking that as you spoke. I don't remember any strings being pulled.
No. But then it would seem natural on all sides, from your family side and possibly from the university as well, that you would go there.
Yes. The one comment to make, it was the first of the 6-year course in Edinburgh. Remember they did that? And that was very dreary. It prolonged the preclinical work. Can't say I enjoyed that either.
How did you find the change from boarding school to university? Was that a happy release, or did you find it traumatic at all?
I found it very different. Yeah, in those days we all went into digs, didn't we? We had landladies who were good or bad. I was lucky to begin with. I was in a big house with a mixture of students. Must have been about 10 of us. But later, because you had to move from time to time, I remember one digs where the landlady was a dragon, and she would tell people when it was time to get the haircut, things like this. And some people accepted that. I can't remember I just thought how dreadful this is, how childish.
What about the teaching? How did that appeal to you? The form of teaching at university when you went to there?
I wasn't a very good student. I tried hard. In fact, I probably tried too hard. But, I'd been educated. I was very privileged, I suppose, that small classes were the order of the day, and individual tuition. And my self-discipline wasn't too good when it came to being lectured to by someone with another 100 and whatever we had then, 140 students. And I'd go home and try and work at night.
So it was very much that of large lecture groups, tutorials and things of the kind were not.
We didn't have so many, did we? No.
No, we didn't.
In fact, we didn't until we came to clinical time.
Well, what about these early? Were there any outstanding characters that you remember in the pre-clinical years?
Among the teachers?
Yeah.
For or against? We had old Professor Brash who taught us anatomy, and that was tricky stuff. Listening to him.
So Jameson had gone by then?
He had gone, but that's it. My father, and I think he knew me through my father. That's where fathers and sons came in, maybe. But he came in a sort of ghost-like way. He must have been very old, and he still wore his black skull cap and all dressed in black. And he'd sort of wander around, and some of us knew who he was, but we didn't quite know what he was there for, and whether we were supposed to notice him or not. But, yes, I did see him. And Dr. Inkster was a lovely man who was more close to us than the professor was.
I think you've already indicated that the long spell in the preclinical time in that 6-year course was a bit tedious, I think. Did you find it that way?
I found it very tedious. I believe they've changed it completely nowadays.
We did seem to have an awful lot of anatomy.
A lot of anatomy. The minutiae of anatomy. When you think about it. And what did we have? Spot. Was it spots?
Yes.
Did you have that too? And that's when it was so often, you were never away from it really. I think that's my memory, if you like, of the abiding memory of the preclinical years. Exam, all the time. You couldn't get away to have a deep think about anything because you had to remember the insertions of the such and such a muscle.
And the exams, I think, were a bit even more, shall we say, pressing, because there was always the thought if you fail exams, you're off to the army.
You'd be off to the services, indeed. In fact, our first year, which was huge, sorry, and had a mixture of people coming back from the army, very mature people. There was a major amongst us, that sort of thing. And they were in a different maturity, of course, than those of us who just left school. But from both these groups, quite a lot of people left after the first year. I don't know how many exactly, but there was a definite loss of quite a lot of people.
Because in the first year you would still be doing chemistry and...
We're doing chemistry and chemistry and physics, which we'd done exactly the same. We'd already done the same at school.
And botany had its own special place.
Botany, I didn't do well in botany, I have to say. I think it was the early morning. Do you remember at that time we had to get up very early in the morning and go down to the Botanic Gardens for an 8 o'clock lecture, was it?
That's right.
For a student, that seemed very, very early.
So the first year was something to be thrilled rather than enjoyed, I think.
Yeah, indeed. First 2 years.
First 2 years. So the clinical years presumably came as something of a relief.
It did, yes, and that obviously was more stimulating. Yes. I think I was quite a diffident sort of student. I wasn't the sort of student who was in the front row of the little group, with all the answers. I tend to be standing in the background, hoping I wasn't going to be asked questions. There'd be others the same as me, I guess.
And by that time, by the time you started to do your clinical year, were you already thinking of psychiatry? Or did you have an open mind about it?
I've told you I'd been involved all my life, and I was just thinking, before I came here, when did I begin to have an interest in psychiatry? And I remember being a member of the Royal Medical Society, and we all had to give dissertations, I think. And I chose as my title, The Psychopath, which was an extraordinary thing to do. I think there was a lot of talk at the time. There'd been one or two unusual murders. Can't remember the names of those involved, but they were deemed to be psychopaths, so that was my theme. But I hadn't thought seriously of psychiatry until I went into the army. That's the next bit of my advance in psychiatry.
So you mentioned the Royal Medical Society, which is really something that other medical schools don't really have anything quite the same as a medical society. Did you find it an important part of your undergraduate life?
I found it a very important part of my personal maturing, if that's the way to put it. And for this reason, it was actually a very small group of my year, of any 1 year, who were in this. I'm not quite sure how I got into it, a friend of a friend sort of thing, and I went along and then I joined it. And in my, whichever year it was, somewhere coming towards the end of my course, yes, it must have been probably my final year, but I was the most junior vice president, and my friends were all the most senior and the next one, and whatever, there were four of them. Anyway, I suddenly discovered that at the annual dinner of the Royal Medical Society, which was attended by all the great and the good of medical people, and others too, I had to give the toast of the guests. And I'd never made a real, I suppose I'd read lessons at school and that stuff, but this was, and looking back now, it was quite an undertaking. And all dressed up in the evening dress, and Sir David Henderson actually was there, not that that affected my ideas about psychiatry. But I thought, I'm never going to be able to do that, make a speech to all these people. And just as I was about to speak, someone sitting forward down sent me, Compton Mackenzie was one of the guests, and he sent me a little message, and I hope you're remembering that Compton Mackenzie did. And it nearly put, of course I hadn't remembered that Compton Mackenzie did this, whatever it was. And the idea, I had my speech totally off by heart. I knew exactly what I was going to say. And it nearly threw me that I was suddenly supposed to be spotted. Anyway, mustn't dwell on that, but it taught me a lot of the fact, it showed me that I could do it. It was the first time I'd ever had a challenge which I almost couldn't cope with. And it made life easier after.
And who were they? I think at any medical school at a particular time, there are fairly dominant personalities that are the sort of stars among the teachers. Who, do you remember any such at your time?
Oh yeah, so if you ask me that, well, the first is Sir Derek Dunlop. Well, I suppose he was the star around my time, because he was such a superb lecturer. Another one who was not the leading academic, but I actually worked with him as a senior house officer later, was Dr. J.K. Slater, who was a physician, a neurologist, general physician. And his style was quite special, and I enjoyed working with him. He was quite suave, I think you'd say, always dressed immaculately. He made a big impact on me. And then, this is coming on a bit, but Henry Matthew, he helped me through the membership of this college by being a superb bedside teacher. But that's not so much as an undergraduate. I didn't know him till I came back from the army.
But Dr. Knott was a very striking personality too, as well as a lecturer. But did you, apart from a lecturer, did you regard him as a good physician, as a
Yes, I think so.
inspiring physician?
I never had the chance of being in his clinic, and I believe that that's where he shone in terms of relating to patients.
You say you went in a clinic. Do you remember how students came to be in particular clinics? I mean, did they volunteer? Were you allotted to clinics, or how did it happen?
Yeah, I do. I think I remember that the word went around among the students who had got it from their seniors who happened to know that it came this way. And I rather went on the judgment of one of my good friends in the year who knew someone much more senior and said, "Oh, put your name down for him, put your name down for him." And I did, and that's the way it went. I think that certainly went that way sometime. Tommy Miller, the surgeon, was a great respect. I think what I was looking for were down-to-earth, not proper doctors, that's a very rude thing to say, but people who were doing general work and
right.
General medicine, general surgery.
So that does seem to indicate that at that time you were still quite open to a certain extent about your future.
Yes.
And then I don't know about how it is for you, but in spite of the fact that very few people failed in finals, the finals themselves were always a very stressful occasion. If I have nightmares about exams, it's still my finals, not anything else. Did they come as this kind of challenge to you, or did it just...
Oh, it was a huge challenge to me. Oh, yes. I was never one who was assured of passing the exams without any troubles. I worked very hard. I think I worked very hard. But certainly in the way you're meaning, I didn't... Yeah, when it came to putting your name down for a job after you qualified, and some people had immediately, long before they qualified, they were going to go and work with Sir Derek Glenalmond, or they were going, that's not the sort of thing I would dare to do. I just kept hoping to get through the exam, and then I would decide what to do.
Well, once you passed finals, the next hurdle was getting house jobs that you wanted. How did that work out?
Well, that worked very well, actually. And I still look back on my two house jobs. One was at Bangor General Hospital, where there was a wonderful experience with a surgeon called Noel Gray, who was a very nice man, very good man. And apart from having to help him when he developed acute indigestion in the middle of a theatre, by passing him antacids so that he didn't have to scrub up again, things like that. But it was a wide experience, lovely experience. And then I went back there as my very first house job. And that was, I was invited to go back, and I felt very happy about it.
Yes, that does give some indication of, I think, how many house jobs worked. You had already made your mark, as it were, in that unit then. You were known, presumably, in Bangor.
Yeah, I think so. I had a very happy 6 months.
Yeah. And what about the medical?
Well, there I'd have to confess that father and this was the only time my father ever came into getting me a job, I think. But no, I hadn't got a job fixed up, but I had high respect for J.D.S. Cameron. And my father had known him as a young man, so I'll phone him up and see. So I got a job at Peel Hospital, where in those days the senior physicians used to go and make sure the junior consultants were, before they were kicked out from that sort of role. So J.D.S. Cameron said, "Oh, well, I think we'd find him a job down at Peel." So I thought that was my second job, and again, lovely general job, great interest. And that's when I really, honestly, that's when I began to enjoy medicine. Not one day before I qualified, I would say.
And then, of course, immediately you 2 house jobs, that would be the national service at that point.
Yeah, some people got deferment. And at that time I did wonder about deferment and psychiatry. But in the end I went into the army, just let's go and get it over.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh, tremendous, tremendous.
Where did you go?
Hated it and loved it. Well, sorry, I have to bring a slight social bit in, because I had met and fallen in love with my wife in my final year. Right, so we got to know each other better over my house jobs on the few occasions when I managed to slip away and go and meet her. Those house jobs being what they were. But we wondered about getting married before I went into the service. But you could, if you got married, you had to do 3 years and you got better pay. But we decided I would go on and get on with it. And anyway, so we got engaged just before I went in. And it was said that you would probably get your first choice of posting. There were about 6 different places you might be sent. So, in a very brave way, I asked for a home posting. And if not a home posting, a Germany posting, which seemed almost within reach of my beloved, you see. So, when the thing came out, I'd been posted to what was called British Commonwealth Forces Korea, Japan. And I couldn't believe, I thought they'd got the thing wrong, but they hadn't. And for this reason, the other big question we were asked was, have you got any specialty interest? And well, now comes in my psychiatric background for what it was, which was that I could spell psychiatry and things like that, you know, and I had a familiarity with it. So I said psychiatry. That went into the records too. So we set off on about 8 colleagues of mine. We'd just reached the RAMC, Army. We set off in this big troop ship bound for Japan. And when we reached, we'll say, Port Said or somewhere, 2 of them were taken off. And I thought, but I'm the one who didn't want to go away at all. Why did they take me off? Anyway, the story goes on that others were taken off. And by the time we reached Japan, I was the only one of these medical officers still on board. And I was quite paranoid. Not obviously paranoid, but feeling I'd really been given a bad deal. So I said to the officer who came down to meet me, you know, what am I doing here? I didn't want to come here. He said, yes, but you're going to be our command psychiatrist. And I said, but I've never done any psychiatry. He said, well, never mind. The troops in that theatre are all being withdrawn now, and we're not really setting up we're reducing the major medical input here, but we do have to have someone labelled command psychiatrist, and you're it. And that was really the beginning of my career in psychiatry.
And how did that work out?
It was fine. I mean, I only did it for in fact it worked out very well, I'll tell you in a moment. I would only be in that role for 3 months, and most of the time I was doing general duties, all the usual sick parades and things, but occasionally I had to examine someone and write a psychiatric report, which wasn't too difficult. After that, I was sent off to Korea as a regimental medical officer with the Camerons, no longer existing. And that would have been it was a lovely experience. I could talk for hours about the extraordinary things that went on across in Korea. But I'd met the consultant in charge of psychiatric services in Singapore, for the Far East, I suppose he was. And he had said, would you like to come and work with me? This was after I'd been in the army 4 or 5 months, probably. And I said yes. So I went to the Cameron Highlanders, and I got on very well. I mean, I'd done enough drill and saluting and stuff at school that they thought I'd make quite a good soldier, if you see what I mean. I understood the system. And I could have stayed on with them, but I got the offer of a job back in Singapore with Colonel Murphy, who was the consultant psychiatrist. So that's how. So I did a full year of my service in Singapore, doing full-time psychiatry. And so that gave me quite a start into the specialty.
Right. I think you're not alone in the time in the army having a formative influence on what you did thereafter.
Yeah, that's right.
Certainly applied to me and many others as I know. How about then the transition from army back into, were you intent on coming back to Edinburgh?
Yes, I think, yes I was. Yes, I was assuming so. I had, at that time, if you were going to try and if you were ambitious at all in psychiatry, you had to be a proper doctor first, as we put it, which meant doing the membership.
Right.
So I came back from the army and as a temporary measure got a job in psychiatry at Roslyn Hospital, which suited me in a domestic way, because I got married as soon as I came out of the army and we settled down. So I did that and then came back to the Royal Infirmary to work with J.K. Slater as an SHO. J.K. Slater and Henry Matthew, who I mentioned earlier. Yeah. And that was when I worked for the membership exam. That's what I did. With the fairly clear idea that I was going back to psychiatry after that.
The membership at that time did offer a special subject.
Yeah.
And did you offer psychiatry?
No, I didn't. I did neurology.
Neurology.
Yeah. I always sort of boasted about that afterwards. That, I didn't need to do... No, I don't mean it didn't need to. I'd done something other than psychiatry. I was quite glad that I'd done that.
And was that the J.K. Slater influence?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Right, and how did you find the membership? Because strangely enough, I was looking up the pass rates at that time, not in relation to Royal College. It was 16%.
Well, I didn't get through the first time. And I got through the second time, which I was quite pleased about that.
At my time, we did a survey of the consultants in the teaching hospital where I was at the time and reviewed them, and the average number of fails was 2.8. So you were better than average.
That's right. Yeah, it was quite... we talked about finals as being quite a stressful time. I worked with a lovely man who was registrar. He'd been in my year, but he hadn't gone... He'd done his service before, that's right, before we did our undergraduate career. And he worked with J.K. Slater as registrar. And he used to teach all the postgraduates who came in to prepare for the membership. And he was a very good teacher, and he knew it well. But he'd never done the membership exam. And the longer time went on, the more difficult it became for him to think of it, psychologically, to think of it. And eventually, he and I did the membership exam together at the same time, and we both failed. And that was it. I began to get ready for the next 6 months, whenever it was. And Jim, my friend, was preparing too. And he never took it. His nerve failed him, you'd have to say. He was too senior. It was going to be such a disaster if he failed again. Do you know where he went? Went off to Canada.
It was a very difficult time, and that leads into something else I wanted to ask you about, because my memory of that time, that competition was such that many of us went in for more than one exam, and one postgraduate degree wasn't enough. You went on after your membership, and then you were going to do one in psychiatry after that.
Yes. Now, when I was going on to do psychiatry, 1960, around 1960, people were beginning to talk of a college of psychiatry, setting up a college. And there was a lot of discussion about it, and a lot of senior psychiatrists who were members and fellows of this college didn't think it was necessary, and thought that it was a bad idea to start a separate college for psychiatrists. But others, more from the south, I have to say, were wildly enthusiastic, and they would come up here and arrange meetings when they told us in strong terms that we had to vote for a college. Anyway, sorry, that's... but when I actually started doing psychiatry at the Royal Edinburgh in 1960, we'll say, you did a DPM, London. Well, that's what I did anyway. There was actually a diploma going in Scotland too. But I did the DPM and didn't do there was no membership of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and I was a foundation member.
Right.
So I never sat an exam for that.
Now, going after your first job and going into psychiatry, how did you manage that? I mean, did you go, for example, and talk to David Henderson about it, or did you simply apply for a post, or how did you?
What did I do? Well, this first job at Roslyn-Lee, that was done a bit in the old boy net. I knew the chap who was physician superintendent there at the time, and he knew that I was coming out of the army, and he gave me a job, basically. There wasn't any competition for that sort of job at the time. Not really. There were jobs to be done. Getting into the Royal Edinburgh training scheme is a different matter. After I'd finished doing my general medicine, they had a very good course going for a diploma by then, that's right. I was committed to the DPM London, but there was now a good course going. And I think I went to see Professor Kennedy, who was the new, just started at that time. And I was told to apply for a job. There was a very good colleague of mine called Alistair Forrest, who was a consultant and senior lecturer, and he gave me good advice about jobs to apply for, and gave me some career ideas too. So I applied for a job at the Royal Edinburgh and got a job in the professorial unit as a registrar.
It's a terribly broad question, but could you say just something about psychiatry as it was at that time? I mean, what were the sort of priorities? What were the sort of major things in psychiatry when you were doing?
Yeah, you mean in clinical terms?
I mean, I was thinking, for example, was that a time when there were analysts around and that kind of psychiatry or not?
Yeah, well, it was looking back, it was an amazing time. Start off with saying this: it was while I was doing my national service and doing psychiatry that Largactil, the famous Largactil, came in as a wonderful control for very disturbed psychotic people. So I remember that was a kind of a special moment in clinical life of having that brand new medicine to help, and it really was a tremendous advance. Coming back to the Royal Edinburgh, and could I just say first, when I went to Roslyn-Lee, I was immediately involved in looking after people with Largactil, with insulin coma therapy, which was seen as a very good treatment for acute schizophrenia. ECT, of course, was pretty widespread. I don't think it deserved to be demonized the way it has now, when people talk about it. But it was fairly crude. People got ECT without an anaesthetic. And some people were put on, what's it called, maintenance ECT, where people who, I guess people who were prone to recurring depressive illness, really depressive, manic depressive depression, and for whom there were no antidepressant drugs. Really. Some of them maybe did quite well on ECT once a month or once in 2 months. I can't remember the details, but it didn't strike me as peculiar at the time. It struck me as being therapeutic at the time. And even insulin coma therapy, which was proved to be nonsense later on, what it did give was a wonderful one-to-one relationship between staff and patient. You know, you'd have about 5 patients acutely ill with psychotic illness, and they were given insulin to put them into a coma. They stayed in a coma for 2 or 3 hours, not giving the exact details, I don't remember, and then they were brought out of a coma. And the rest of the day they were totally involved in activities with the small band of staff who worked with them, 2 or 3 nurses, occupational therapist, a doctor now and again, you know, seeing them regularly. And of course that was therapeutic. If only people had recognised that at the time, they could have saved a bit of insulin, maybe developed more staffing for psychiatric patients.
I ask because I remember psychiatry at that time, because in Glasgow I could see what was happening at Gart-Navel, and there they had somebody who was very much an analyst. There was R.D. Lane.
Oh yes.
We also had insulin coma with ECT, and it seemed to me that psychiatry at that time, there were lots of different forms of psychiatry, it seemed.
Yeah, but there were different forms of psychiatrists too.
Yes.
In that, what the analysts were doing were not really, they were only just accepted and no more by the organic side. At the Royal Edinburgh, I don't think I'm imagining this, the Royal Edinburgh was ruled by Sir David Henderson for many years, up until just before I started psychiatry. And he had trained in America in a totally non-analytic setting. And he didn't really go for this analysis business. So much so that there was a little clinic called the Davidson Clinic, which was an analytic treatment centre along at Salisbury, Newington. And no one at the Royal Edinburgh would have anything to do with that. It was just not acceptable. Psychoanalysis was out as far as the Royal Edinburgh was concerned. And then, this is all changing within just a few years. There were 1 or 2 people around who were now practicing psychoanalysis. And I think the big change came after Maurice Carstairs became professor. And he had a wonderful gift for bringing in a range of high-quality psychiatric specialists, so that there'd be a biochemical sort of academic member of staff, and there'd be an analytic member of staff, and there'd be he brought Maxwell Jones back from America to be a therapeutic community man down at Dingleton, and he was a very charismatic figure. Without naming names, he had he knew what he wanted. He knew he wanted to broaden the interest of Edinburgh, the academic unit, and make sure that they had lots of different specialists working there. It was very good.
And which of these channels have attracted you particularly?
I was in the middle of the room. Well, you now had an opportunity of a touch of everything that you would have. Oh, I know the other name I was going to mention, because that was pretty important. A chap called Jock Sutherland, who was an Edinburgh man, but he'd been the director of the Tavistock Clinic, the big psychoanalytic centre in London. And he retired, came back here, but had a job at the Royal Edinburgh, and was a very important figure in the world of psychoanalysis. And he would train junior staff. Didn't have that experience. He trained a number of junior staff with a personal analysis. And he was around the place making suitable psychoanalytic noises, and just helped us all to take a broader look of this aspect of psychiatry. That happened, and then Maurice Carstairs was bringing in all these things too. I have to just mention one thing, and that he decided that we should have group meetings in the morning. This is when group meetings suddenly seemed to be the essential part of psychiatric practice, when at 9 o'clock every morning, everyone sat round in a circle. It included the consultant, and if he was there, the medical staff, nursing, all the patients, the cleaners, the occupational therapist, everyone sat round. And I continued doing that for quite a few years in my own clinical practice. And it was a way of, to my mind, it was a way of just making sure we knew each other and knew who was there. The actual therapeutic goals became more limited as far as I was concerned. Initially, I think it was supposed to allow all sorts of deep problems to be aired and passed around. And when we started it, we would sit in silence, 40 minutes I think it was supposed to be, or maybe 30 minutes, and we all sat down. And no one liked to start. And sometimes it would go on the whole, you just sit there in silence, and then it was often the senior registrar who was actually leading this group. Look at this one. Right, thank you very much.
Was that, I'm not quite clear what the meetings were about. These were not clinical meetings discussing particular patients.
No. This is just one tiny bit of it. We'd have group treatment of maybe 10 patients with a therapist, co-therapist, and that was much more centred on patients' individual problems and relationships. And these were discussed in a very confidential, intimate way. But this wider thing, the man I mentioned earlier, Maxwell Jones, had brought in this concept of the therapeutic community. After the war, he had lots of ex-servicemen or people with traumatic conditions from service, and he took them at the Henderson Hospital. Was that where he had first? Down in England anyway, and evolved this form of treatment which required people to share their experiences and be in a group, and everything that happened in the hospital was reckoned to be important for their treatment.
And you mentioned even the cleaners, so it was pretty all-encompassing.
It was indeed. The danger, of course, was that the whole conversation descended to what people were getting for lunch tomorrow and was the food good. But maybe that was useful. It gave people a chance to express themselves. So anyway, I was involved in that.
So how long were you? That was a training period then. Was it a set period of training?
Things moved on. I did by then we had Maurice Carstairs had brought an MRC unit to Edinburgh in the epidemiological research. What was it called? Yes, epidemiology of psychiatry. I'm just trying to remember. Anyway, I was quite interested in doing some research and in just research in psychiatry, and not organic, not chemical, but I suppose environmental research. The very thing that was going on in this unit. So I was given a chance to move over from senior registrar grade to work in this MRC unit. And I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was intrigued. It was with general practitioners. It was a time when there was a lot of interest among general practitioners, I think, in psychiatric aspects of their practice, psychological aspects. and I wish I could remember his name. He was a well-known doctor who ran clinics, ran sessions for general practitioners. I should know his name. Anyway, that was very popular at the time. And I did a bit of research into patient referrals from general practice, something like that. And I remember I had a well-known general practitioner in Edinburgh at the time was Dr. Kunsberg, who died not too long ago. But he was a very strong person. And I remember going down as a relatively confident, bright young thing as a researcher to meet the local GP committee to tell them what I was going to do. I shouldn't have put it that way because he told me pretty clearly what I couldn't do and what I shouldn't do and what I might do and what would be a complete waste of my time doing. I came away feeling slightly chastised by that. But that's what I did while I was with the MRC unit.
Which leads me back to some general comment about training in those days. I mean, you had done the membership and the DPM, but I think there was a certain amount to get publications in there. Was there the same pressure on you, do you think, at that point?
I can't boast too much about my publications. The one or two things that I published were totally connected with the work I was doing in the ward, admission policies and the types of pretty descriptive things. No, I never saw myself as going into academic psychiatry.
So the
I
sort of
think
publication.
probably I was just ahead of, would I be, of really having to put in your CV a number of publications.
I mean, from the time you opted to go into psychiatry until you get, let's say, an established post.
Yes.
Did you, during that, was your course through that more or less a continuum, or did you have to apply individually for posts, or were you, as it were, guided through it by, say, Maurice Carstairs? I mean, how did that work at that time in psychiatry?
Yeah. People would apply to get onto the Edinburgh diploma. Just going back to when I came in, having already got the membership, this membership, and therefore knowing that I would just do the DPM because I kept going. I just did the exam. But others would have applied to come to Edinburgh, and some of them were quite well qualified and with other interests in the past. So after that, you took your chance in senior registrar. I mean, once you'd got the course behind you, you could go away and apply for a consultant job, I guess. But I applied for the senior registrar job in the professorial unit. I was fortunate to get that job. Then I was into the MRC unit. That was a sideways move, really.
And then from there into a consultant post?
Sorry?
Did you go from the MRC into a consultant post?
Yes. That's when I think I realised that I was trying to think of the right way. I wanted to just work in the health service and try to be a good consultant and work in a psychiatric hospital.
Right.
And this job came up, which I thought, I'm not really ready for this, but it was at Haddington, Herdman Flat Hospital, Haddington, which had 200-something beds, lovely East Lothian countryside, very old-fashioned hospital. It didn't have a consultant. It had a visiting consultant who was Dr. Hegarty, the name I mentioned to you at Rosalind Lee, and he used to go down once a week to keep an eye on the, what you'd call them now, staff grade psychiatrists.
SHMO.
There was an SHMO who ran it and had been there for a long time. So this was a brand new, exciting, just what a young, enthusiastic consultant would like. And I would say to someone in the MRC unit, gosh, that would be a lovely job, I wish I could. And they let me go. Maybe they wanted to let me go, but they let me go anyway and said, if that's what you want to do, you go and do it. So I applied for that job and got it.
But your relationship then with an SHMO might potential for difficulty.
Well, that particular person had left. He just left. So it was even more.
So what was the sort of staffing situation in a hospital like that at that time, before you went, say in Haddington?
There'd be two doctors, there'd be an SHMO, and there was another, someone I got to know very well, who would be an assistant psychiatrist, who was the wife of a local GP, and she'd been in the business the business of psychiatry for quite a number of years. Didn't have a higher qualification, but I think she'd gone into classes at some stage, and she really ran the place. She really ran the place. Quite difficult for me, because she reckoned she knew more or less how to run the thing and patients. It was a very, very traditional hospital staff. Lovely people, old-fashioned. They were kind and caring. That's as far as it went.
And the turnover of that 200.
Well, there would be how did it work? There were admission wards. I mean, I shouldn't underestimate it. We had clinics going in North Berwick and in one or two other places in East Lothian. It was quite active. But a lot of the patients, of course, were long stay, and a lot of this is when we're into the ageing population business. Of quite a lot of people there who'd been there for a long time were now getting very, very old, and there weren't really good facilities for them.
I think we should stop for tea.
Oh.
Could I ask then about your time as a consultant in psychiatry? How would you describe your practice as sort of general psychiatry, or does it need to be described in a more particular way?
No, it was very much general psychiatry through the first part of my career. Well, first of all, out at Haddington, it was very much general psychiatry, very much working with GPs. Going out into the community quite a lot, and a whole range of psychiatry. When I came back to the Royal Edinburgh, it was more intense. I was doing acute psychiatry, working in the Andrew Duncan Clinic and seeing all ages, all stages. While I was there, we went through a variety of developments, I'd say, and one very simple thing that we did was divide the hospital units into catchment areas, which was a great thing in this respect, that we now, at that time there'd be 4 consultants, I suppose, dealing with acute psychiatry in 4 separate wards. And when I went back first, if a patient came up on a Monday and saw such and such a team, then they were put into that ward. Next time they came back on a Tuesday, they might be into a different unit under a different team. And I think it did prove helpful in the development of community care and in the multi-professional, all these words which we take for granted now, multi-professional contacts with social work, with local authority, with local community groups, that we took a responsibility for this group, and it meant we couldn't, if we wanted to, if we might have done, have managed not to take in some particularly difficult patient because he'd arrived on a Tuesday instead of a Monday, if you see what I mean. You wouldn't have that great real sense of responsibility for everything that happened in your catchment area. I thought that was a great improvement.
Just before we go on with that, could we just go back? This change from Haddington back to the Royal, how did that come about? Was that something you wanted to do, or was it part of bigger change?
It was, I applied for a consultant job. I mean, someone I knew in the Royal Edinburgh, one of the senior academic people, told me this job was coming up and said, you should apply for this. So I was given a little bit of a come on, that it might be a good thing for you to do.
What happened to Haddington and the places like Haddington? Let's say after you left, you weren't there.
Well, they still continued for a long time, and I mean, I hear Roslyn Lee, which I visited the other day. It's virtually closed now. Haddington is still going, as far as I know. I mean, in the period after I left, they appointed someone else there, and then someone else, then someone else. I think very shortly there were 3 consultants, where I'd been 1 consultant. So they were booming in the, whenever that would be, the 60s and 70s. But no, I don't think I can't just think what would have happened. They levelled out, but they continued to be actively.
So they've worked out of this situation of being 200 with only 1 consultant.
Yes.
Do you think that generally these places are now better staffed than they were?
Well, up until the last decade, perhaps, when they have tended to be closing down again, right. Not losing their staff, but working in the community. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what happened at the Royal Edinburgh, if I'm going on there a bit, that gradually patients were moved out into hostels, that story, and seen at day hospitals, things like that. So that there was a diminution in the need for beds, right. but not for services. I think that's been in more recent years, that's been the change.
And that's been general in psychiatry?
I would say so, yes.
And do you think this has it worked, or has it caused just
Well, I could
problems?
be very old-fashioned. I remember when I was chairman of the Scottish division of the Royal College at the time, when there was a great upsurge of interest in closing down the mental hospitals. And there was a lot of feeling about it. And I remember on behalf of the college, of our division, writing to the Scotsman saying it was some very dramatic statement about Scottish psychiatrists will not put their patients out until there are proper facilities for them. It was a kind of statement about. And I was harangued by non-psychiatrists for having put my name to this thing. You've got to get them out in the community. But I think I was right to this extent that even now, the picture I have is that community care is a great idea, but unless you've got enough professional staff working in the community, then it's likely to be less. The great thing in the old days, which I'm not defending, but people really knew, the staff really knew their patients because there were more inpatient time, more close contact with them. And I think the patients knew their nursing staff. I may be wrong, I may be biased about it, but that certainly has been the great movement in the last 20 years or so, I would think.
Well, this may be a slight digression, but I'm interested in this thing of the community care with working with other people like social workers and so on. I mean, in the caring community, did that, if I can call them supporting staff, you know what I mean, are they sort of dedicated to psychiatry and that, or are they just simply part of a bigger pool, let's say, of social workers?
That's come and gone as far as I know. It's varied over the years. We had we had PSWs that were called psychiatric social workers,
right.
who were highly trained in psychiatric matters and who dealt only with psychiatric patients. And then at some stage, I forget when, social work expanded and social workers were social workers.
Yes.
Probably you remember that too. And I think probably we lost the specialist social worker in the hospital, and instead of that they came to us from the large social work department. I think nurses, community nurses, began to have an impact. And they were trained psychiatric nurses who were now working full-time in the community.
And in this, the community psychiatry, that way, I mean, did the people working in one sector, let's say a geographical sector in Edinburgh, did they meet regularly together, or did you have that kind of Carstairs type meeting, if I could call them that, these people?
Let me think now. One aspect of the community care was simply that patients from long stay, I remember this bit of it very well, but patients from long stay wards suffering from chronic psychosis often were moved in a deliberate way into small units outside the hospital. Now that's not really what people mean by community care, but it was a great step forward, because you'd have what my much loved colleague Jim Affleck, who was physician superintendent before me, what he did, if a doctor's house came free or some other staff accommodation, he would take it over for patients. So there was a house in Craigley Drive, I think it was, which now became a patient's hostel, and there'd be a nurse or two in charge and maybe 8 or 10 patients, don't remember the numbers. And they lived a fairly independent life and managed very well indeed. And they had much more flexibility, much more freedom. It was sometimes said that they were now separated off from all the best bit of hospital life, of activities all day long, of moving around. Some of them maybe became more isolated in these little hospitals. But in general, I think that was a good idea, entirely controlled and organised by the health service, by the psychiatric service. And then as far as wider day centres were concerned, this is answering your question. I think meetings between the psychiatry professionals, whether it be the psychiatry team, you'd say, which could include the psychiatric nurse, would meet with voluntary groups and with the social work departments. I'm trying to remember. I dealt with Craig Miller at one time when I was doing that job, and I used to go down fairly regularly to have meetings with the local group. I think that was helpful.
These houses that you mentioned, these were off-site, they weren't in the...
They were off-site, yeah. Yes.
How did the people round about react to this? Did you have any objections from neighbours or anything else?
I think it was done... I think not. I think it was done very carefully and with a lot of preparation. I don't think there was a problem. We sometimes used to think that our local Morningside residents, the people living in Morningside, just didn't recognise the existence of the Royal Edinburgh at all. They denied that they had this great institution in their midst. So it was quite... There was one, I don't know if it was true, it was the story of an old chap who wandered out of the hospital in his nightie and went along and stood in the bus queue in Morningside Road, and everyone just stood beside him and didn't look too closely at this. Certainly didn't recognise he had a problem. So I don't know. I don't think there have been problems since. I'm told even down in Haddington they tried to produce a day unit or maybe a small residential home, and there were great noises against it. I remember getting a letter from a local GP, this is after I retired I think, asking me if I would support their plea that mental hospital patients shouldn't be allowed to come near. So I didn't support that, needless to say.
So you were a consultant psychiatrist between when, what sort of...
64
until
I joined the Mental Welfare Commission, which was 84 really. And
what can you comment on the sort of trends of psychiatry in that time? I mean, did it change much?
Yeah, it changed in terms of medication available. There were always new antidepressants coming in, but I can't say that they changed the face of psychiatry in a dramatic way. They made a difference. The other bit, though, was perhaps is more important, that we did, over that time, we did try to identify the different needs of different groups of patients, so that we were all the time, we were in the hospital setting, we were trying to set up appropriate units for different, and my role in that, actually, when I think about it, was to do with the elderly, because latterly I'd call myself a psychogeriatrician, and it was as simple as this, that go back to the Roslyn Lee days, which is a long time ago, I know, and the ageing population in the hospital, they sat in a ward all day long, and quite a proportion of them sat on a commode all day long, and quite a lot of them would have their bandages just to make sure they stayed in their seat, their commode seat all day long. I mean, it was pretty primitive and pretty nasty, and yet kindly, the nurses were lovely to them and looked after them well, but that was the sort of atmosphere. And then, when I was a consultant in general psychiatry, in the Andrew Duncan Clinic, we were finding that the advancing dementia problem, the ageing population, all the stuff that people talk about now, was such that we'd get an old demented patient into our acute ward, and it would cause havoc. And it became bad for the patient, for the old folk, and bad for the younger people. And so I did get involved very much then in reviewing our long stay wards. That's right. We managed to change these hundreds of beds, I suppose it would be at that time, 4 or 5 wards with 30, 40 patients and 30 patients. Anyway, leaving aside numbers, we managed to divide them up so that we had the truly long-stay psychotic patient with their particular needs, and another ward for functionally disturbed old people with depressive illness and paranoid states and things, and the dementias. And by dividing them up, I really think it made a big impact on the care that they got and the throughput, because the second group there should be curable and treatable and outable. There should be no reason why they shouldn't go out of hospital again. Or a day hospital. We set up day hospitals for them, whereas the really severe demented person required a different sort of care, and they built that huge what was I involved in? The Jardine Clinic, especially for dementia.
So you would think that this kind of oversee and review of the management and groups and so on, that has had more influence than the drug therapy and the pharmacology, do you think?
I think it deserves to be
at least equal.
It deserves to be considered as such, yes, yes. Because each time, if you think of it, each time you have a ward or a group of patients where there are one or two inappropriately placed patients, they create havoc. Whichever group they're in, they create havoc for the others. They take up a huge amount of nursing time at the expense of the others, and don't help very much. So I think that has been an important change.
And and this growth in the dementia and the older people is just an unavoidable problem, do you think? It's just going to happen.
Yes. And one of my jobs in the university side of life was to do the lecturing on psychogeriatrics, on the ageing, I forget, psychiatric illness in the elderly, or something like that. And this was in the 70s, yeah. And I gave my little lecture, a series of lectures. And the big graph, of course, the most essential graph that you put up was this thing showing how many old people there would be in maybe 2006. You know, that the huge increase in population. And a sad thing to me is that was never, at a political level, I mean, in terms of the public at large and the politicians, they never really paid attention to that. I don't mean to me, but to that kind of graph, did they? And so you still heard people, and I think everyone accepts it now, but say 5 years ago, you would still hear politicians announcing this as if it was a brand new discovery. And yet of all statistics, that was the most obvious one, because it was people who were born, it was birth rates that they were talking about. And the fact that this birth rate meant that in 80 years on, there'd be a heck of a lot of old people with dementia and everything else.
What about the time of the onset of the problem of dementia? Has that moved on as people get older? Is there any kind of improvement in that?
I thought it was just in terms of percentages of population.
Yeah.
I don't know that. I'm not sure.
I was just wondering if there could conceivably any kind of mitigating factor that the dementia perhaps at least came later in life. But that hasn't become.
I'd like to think so. I don't think I've kept up to date with that sort of thing.
And we've both got a vested interest.
That's true, yes. There seemed to be more, in these lectures that I gave, one lecture was on pre-senile dementia. Interesting, we had to talk about the dementia occurring in younger people. And at that time, if you remember, Alzheimer's was it was the name of a pre-senile dementia. Alzheimer's, Pick's and Jakob Creutzfeldt or something were all pre-senile dementias. And somehow or other the name Alzheimer got taken over by different people. Well, I know why it was to do with pathology, but no, I'm keeping off your story of whether we're likely to do better than they used to do.
So, could we move on and just ask you about the next part of your career after you moved from psychiatry into literature?
So, yeah, I will, but can I just say, well, you were asking what changes I might have. The other important thing that I like to think I was involved in very closely was in seeing people in their homes, not the old-fashioned domiciliary diagnostic visit. Well, it was, but more than that, if you saw people in their homes, you could make a much better judgment of what their needs were. And if you involved, as I did, a social worker, or more often a health visitor, I happened to have on my staff, in my group, a health visitor who was superb at this. And she would go and see the patient and the relatives too. And by having that connection, I do think we were able to help people to stay out of hospital. And that's a long time ago now, really, when we were starting. Anyway, I applied for the job at the Mental Welfare Commission, partly because I probably remember, this is going back to my childhood, it's funny when I sit here and think about it, I remember the Mental Welfare Commissioners used to come to Stratheden as I was a little boy, and they obviously made an impact. You know, my father would put on his best suit that day, and it was quite an important occasion, and they did influence the hospitals, and they wrote a report after each visit, which the hospital had to pay attention to. And yeah, they had. Anyway, I thought highly of them as a sort of deep inside me. I knew that they should be doing a good job. And so a new Mental Health Act came in 1984, and the old Board of Control, which had been its previous name, went out of business, and a new mental welfare commission came in with more powers, a bigger job to do. And I looked at this and I suddenly thought, well, that's for me. I think I'd like to do this. And I knew a lot of psychiatrists all around Scotland because I'd been chairman of the division and I'd been to various. I thought, yeah, this would be quite nice to go and visit everyone. And it was at a time when I discovered that you could make a useful contribution to the clinical care of patients. I mean, this is my own view of what I was doing. Maybe others wouldn't agree. But I do think that there were a lot of consultants running their practices around Scotland who found it useful, found it valuable to have a second opinion, really a second opinion doctor. And that's what you were. You were looking at clinical conditions. You weren't just looking at forms and signing things. You had, ultimately, you did have responsibilities in the field of detention under the Mental Health Act and appeals against detention by individual patients. But you had a wider remit than that, because your remit was to look at the care of all patients in the psychiatric settings, rather than previously, where I think you'd been limited to discuss the case of William Bloggs, who was in trouble, and you weren't supposed to look at the whole setup. So it was exciting times, really, because this was a new experience, and we had to test out the bounds of what was expected of us and what we could do. For example, I remember when we'd get complaints from relatives, letters would come in about this and that, and complaints about the poor quality of care in various settings, but the one I was remembering just now was the bad state of the nursing service. The bad state of the night nursing service. And we said, all right, we'll do a night visit. So we got into 2 fast cars and felt really like that we were really important, and knocked on the door of the unit that we were coming to look at. And a sleepy-eyed nurse came and said, "Meh," and we said, from the Mental Welfare Commission, and he said, "What's that?" And we went in and we looked and we made our report, but it raised a lot of concern from the managers of the hospitals that did we really have right to do this? They didn't want us to go. And I think in the end, the compromise that we would notify the district manager or someone, chairman of the trust, or we didn't have trust then, but we'd tell someone they were going, but he was honour bound not to pass it on to the troops. So that we were still supposed to be making unannounced visits, that's what it was called. Anyway, that was a tiny bit of our job, but it was a sort of new thing that we were doing, which was quite exciting.
And did you find a lot of things that had to be put right?
Oh, there were a lot of things. But, one thing I don't know how you got round is, we went to what was then called the mental hand, Lennox Castle. Lennox Castle. And the conditions there were really pretty appalling. Large institution, very traditional, bad accommodation was bad, and care was bad, clothing, sort of personal things was bad. And we really got our teeth into that and went back, or when I say maybe 6 monthly, making very urgent reports to the Greater Glasgow Health Board, or whatever it was called, saying this has to change, this is dreadful. Well, eventually it was changed. Huge amounts of money were poured in, huge amounts of money, and the wards were made very much better, patients' care very much better. And then the wheel turned, and Lennox Castle was being closed. And it makes you think, what is our role in the world, really, all of us? Because we think we've got a good idea, we think we're going to change everything, and then, by golly, it's all in vain.
Okay. But I think Lennox Castle was a special case, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
Even I had vibes of how poor it was.
Yes.
Back then.
Well, I'm sure you would. I'm sure you would.
And that was what the welfare does entirely. Does it have any other kind of legal obligations or anything?
Well, no, of course it's all changed now. There's a new mental health act has just come in, which I haven't read. I have no idea what they do now. No idea. I thought it's past that. I don't need to learn up the different sections of the act. The crucial thing in that last act from 84 till now was this obligation to look at the whole picture of the care of anyone with psychiatric illness. Which allowed us to look at everything from the cleanliness and the cooking and that. There was another group set up around the same time, of course, called Scottish Advisory. What did I say? Yes, what was it called? SHAS, Scottish Hospital Advisory Service. And they were a completely different organisation, but we did overlap, I suspect. And they were.
So how long did you do that until you retired?
About 8 years, I suppose. 8 years, and then, just to finish my story of what I did, I was during that time, I was also treasurer of our London-based College of Psychiatry. I was going down fairly often, very, very regularly, as you would know, to the meetings in the college, and much involved in the development of policies, national policies, which was interesting enough. And then I was just retiring from both jobs, really, and I was asked to to be involved in an inquiry into homicides and suicides among psychiatric patients. Initially in England and Wales, actually it was, and then it came to Scotland later. That was one of the least happy stages in my life. For this reason, I was asked to do it in a personal way by the president of the college, and I thought that was so useful. The idea was that my fellow consultants around England, who they all knew because I'd written asking them to pay their annual subscription, so my name was known to them, and I knew lots of them anyway, and I must have been seen to be a reasonably honest kind of guy, or straightforward. And the idea was that the confidential inquiry meant that I would write to all the consultants, or have it known, that if they had a case of homicide or suicide among any of their patients, they would let me know, and I would write to them. And the whole object of the thing was to try and see if there were any common threads in all these unfortunate cases. Not many homicides, of course, but quite a lot of suicides. And that once when they were all writing to me, reporting on these cases, I would be able to write a report emphasising any aspects at all which should be improved. Seemed a fairly straight. Well, of course, it got all tied up into politics, and the Department of Health had to have an advisor there. The nursing profession had to have someone there. I forget what it was called. It wasn't called the supporting committee, it was something. But by golly, they were controlling committee. For me to write a draft of something was just the beginning of a long, tedious job. And then we had to make sure it was all statistically significant, and then we had to make sure that... At one time, all my beautiful English prose had to be sent off to a proper writer to have it all changed into better English, which I took a bit of exception to. I don't think they changed it much, but it was this need. It was some political correctness. It wasn't called that then, but it was this awful feeling that we couldn't say anything which might upset people or might be challengeable. So what I thought was to be a 6-month job ended up, I think, 2 years. But I was going down to London every week, and I had a secretary in the college, And I met all these funny people regularly. I didn't enjoy it much. And it wasn't, in the end we produced a report, a perfectly good report in a bright orange colour, I remember it still. But it was hardly, I think something else much more exciting came on the market at the same time, and it didn't make a big impact. Although, when I left it, someone else took on my job, and it still goes on, this inquiry. So, you know, I think the same things certainly in surgery, probably other specialties too. So I suppose it was the beginning of getting the confidence of fellow consultants to take part in it all. So maybe that was useful. Anyway, that was my swan song in my psychiatric career.
Can I now ask the very awkward question? Look back at the whole thing and thinking of somebody perhaps looking at this interview maybe 20 years from now. I mean, what would be the main thing that has changed or impact of psychiatry that you think would be surprising, let's say, to somebody later, if that's not an impossible question? I mean, I'm really concentrating on things that you have seen change over time. Yes. Good and bad. The good bit is, which I hope I've emphasised to some extent, is the way in which psychiatric patients are no longer so isolated and moved out into the community. The care of people with psychiatric disorder moved out into the community. Closer cooperation, I guess, between different professions, especially between general practice and psychiatry. I think that's improved. I still get very sad at how psychiatric patients are still seen by the media, by people. They are kept very separate. I suppose that's the thing which still puzzles me and worries me. Because, let's face it, if someone is severely ill, well, I don't mean mild neuroses and things where people seem to be just the same as the rest of us, but when people are quite disturbed, of course it's disruptive in an office or in a home, in the domestic. So of course it is. But somehow that's exaggerated and widened by society. So I think people still hardly accept the nature of psychiatric illness and the extent of the range of psychiatric disorders. I think that disappoints me. So that's the opposite of progress. That's saying nothing changes. But what about the input into psychiatry, or people taking up psychiatry and going in there? I mean, is that in a healthy state for the future, do you think?
Maybe I shouldn't comment. Maybe I don't know. Certainly, in my time, there was a huge increase in the number of people who were coming into psychiatry, and in the background of people who were coming into psychiatry. Because back there, and now I'm talking about the 80s, I suppose, the number of highly qualified doctors with lots of interesting experience, clinical experience already, deciding to come into psychiatry was quite satisfying, really. That was very good.
So we can end on an optimistic note.
We must.
Thank you very much.